all of these things kind of came together to pull together this book in a very almost magical way, but also left me with a whole list of loose ends or other avenues of things that I really want to explore more.
Oh, you are in for a treat today, listeners, as we are so honored for the second time with the esoteric insights and scholarly meticulousness of Mr. Joseph H. Peterson. So listeners, thank you so much for pulling up a chair and stopping by the Glitch Bottle podcast today. I'm your host, Alexander Eth, and indeed, today we are honored to speak again with Joseph Peterson. Now, if you want to hear the first chat that I had with this awesome scholar, author, editor, and legendary esoteric authority, please make sure to check that out. That is episode number 14. But for this episode, Joe shares about his latest publication, The Secrets of Solomon, a witch's handbook from the trial records of the Venetian Inquisition. Now, Joe has spent decades searching for this elusive text, and he translates and presents it in this tome for the first time. Now, Joe shares about what makes this text so important, especially as it relates to the Grimorium Verum and other European grimoires, as well as he answers listener questions, and he also offers special insights into this and other esoteric topics. I am so appreciative of Joe sharing his time and wisdom with us, and I truly hope you enjoy this latest chat. And also make sure to stay tuned at the end of this chat for some show updates. And now, to help us uncork the uncommon, I give you the excellent Mr. Joseph H. Peterson. Joseph H. Peterson, thank you so much, as always, for your time and for coming back on the Glitch Bottle podcast today.
Hi, Alexander. I appreciate your calling and enjoyed talking with you last time. I'm really looking forward to talking to you again.
And the last time, Joe, you were on the podcast, you mentioned the work that you were doing into the Ars Rabidmadar and the different various texts around that. And since that conversation, you have released The Secrets of Solomon, a witch's handbook from the trial records of the Venetian Inquisition. And this is your edited and translated edition of the Ars Rabidmadar. Can you give us an overall feeling of what is the Ars Rabidmadar, and how did you kind of come to get interested in researching this text?
Sure, thank you. Well, Ars Rabidmadar is one of the phrases that is used in the book to explain itself, the art of Rabidmadar, which is one of the spirits. It also calls itself Secrets of Solomon, or the key to the secrets, or the secret of the secrets. There's a number of variations of the title, but it's a magic text, probably late 1500s when it originated. But it's very, very interesting to me. It has connections with Grimorium Verum and other folk practices, but it really is interesting in the extent that it was used by practicing witches. The trial records has a ton of information on the actual practices of these people that were involved in the trial, and it really uncovers a huge network of magical collaborators going all the way from the nobility down to the merchants and common people, and just a vast network of people distributing and copying magic texts and using them throughout Europe, and especially, in the Venetian Inquisition. This was from the trial records. My primary manuscript was from the Venetian Inquisition. The collaborators were all Italian, or largely, but really the larger network throughout Europe. So I searched for different manuscripts of it, and it seemed like they all just, once I got going on it, more and more manuscripts popped up, and there was a lot of fun researching. There's a lot of different topics that I had not gotten into before, especially the folk practice. I had mainly been researching a lot of what's usually referred to as scholastic magic and the theoretical magic and not necessarily obvious when reading some of those texts that it would actually have been used by anyone, like Storm Book of Anurius. It's hard to imagine someone going through all the rigors of practicing that, although I guess it's possible. But this is clearly much, much simpler and more in tune with the type of folk practice that you see today.
How is the Ars Rabidmadar here? How is the Secrets of Solomon a bridge between kind of the classical ritual magic of Europe and the kind of folk practices? What are some of the top examples that might come to mind?
Using local ingredients, sympathetic ingredients as part of the charms, just the fact that the incantations were very short and accompanied by music, maybe very theatrical, perhaps some elements of performance art for the practitioners, for the clients that they're serving, that sort of thing.
You highlight two of the owners of this manuscript, I believe a tailor and a monk, which sounds like the opening of a bad joke, but it's actually a very cool kind of miniature story that you tell historically. Can you share about the owners of these manuscripts?
Yeah, there's actually 5 people, I think, that were listed in the court case as collaborators. The two main ones, Longo and Viola, were kind of hinge pins, but they brought in the other collaborators that were all involved and practiced at the same time, attended the rituals and things of that nature. Yeah, Longo was apparently a monk, had a lot of experience with astrology, casting horoscopes and that sort of thing. Was kind of a part-time physician or practiced medicine at some point. And in fact, one of the main connections, I mentioned the Spanish ambassador, he had connections with the Spanish embassy, and he had actually performed a successful healing on the Spanish ambassador, who had, I believe, kidney stones. So he did practice surgery and medicine as well as astrology, which was, maybe more typical than we think of for modern practitioners. But I'm thinking of Simon Foreman, for example, being a medical professional as well as a magician. He had connections quite extensive and was able to procure some of the magic texts that were involved for people that requested him. Viola was a tailor, as I mentioned. Another one of the corroborators was Marco Carrati, and he was a tanner, so supplied leather goods for them. Pietro Rinaldi was another tailor that was involved. I mentioned the 2 Jewish magicians that they pulled into their practices, and the backstories of each of them is actually pretty interesting. I mentioned the incident of the skull in there briefly, but there's quite a bit of material about this Moses Maestro and some of the incidents that people were attesting about his experiences or run-ins with the Inquisition previously. The fact that it was fairly extensive and had connections up to the embassy level, it included some Jews, just very high visibility to the Inquisition because of the fact that there were both connections with the nobility, with gambling, had Jews involved. It kind of raised the importance to the inquisitors to investigate it.
That is interesting, and if memory serves, one of the spirits in the Heptameron of Wednesday, Miel, I believe, in the Secrets of Solomon, Miel is not only just a minister of Raphael and the angels of Wednesday, but Miel has a sigil that looks like dice, and Miel is used for gambling. So it sounds like a lot of the sigils, and that, especially that connection of gambling, too, was really... As you say, it kind of elevated the attention that it got from certain of the ecclesiastical authorities?
Yeah, gaming was extremely popular back then, and people were heavily involved and could easily get into debt. And this was a fairly big thing. And actually, I've seen this in other grimoires as well, methods for improving your gambling. But this was some of the more interesting ones were included in the Secrets of Solomon. As you mentioned, some of the later spirits had sigils like the dice one that you mentioned that could be used as a sort of an amulet. And actually, some of the spirits were said to be able to whisper in your ear what cards your opponent is playing and things like that. So this is probably the undoing of the conspirators, and why they ended up on trial is because they had mixed success with their practices. And some of them, I think Marco Corradi in particular, lost a lot of money at gambling and blamed Longo and the others and actually reported them to the Inquisition, and became their undoing, so to speak.
What are some of the big historical currents that might facilitate or buoy an interest in someone compiling and kind of grabbing a piece from here and, here's a little part of the Heptameron that I could incorporate? Can you just talk about the big historical currents at the time that led to perhaps the compiling of the Secrets of Solomon?
Well, I think there was a lot of evidence in the text that the person who compiled it was very educated, probably educated in a monastery, was familiar with a lot of the medieval philosophers and writings of Cicero, for instance, in the more ancient writings, pulled a lot of inspiration from the classic learning or classic medieval learning, scholastic learning. As far as the folk practice, I think it's fairly clear that they were familiar with, at least to some extent, the Key of Solomon proper, what I refer to as the Key of Solomon proper, although there's many different texts that claim that title, but the one that's most generally associated with it. But there isn't a lot of overlap with this text, and it kind of explains it as dealing with a different class of spirits. The Heptameron, clearly they were familiar with, and some astrological writings that they drew on. The construction of the magic image that constitutes the last book of this compilation, clearly they used Pseudo-Agrippa as one of the sources for expounding on how to do consecrations, but the whole concept of making a magic image that's kind of central to your magic work. I'm not familiar with all the sources that might be involved there, but clearly there's a lot that went into this.
When it comes to, quote unquote, cunning man magical grimoires or kind of folk magic practices, there's always attached to that an element of practicality, and this stuff has been tried out and practiced, as opposed to, say, a lofty, 17th century English angel magician grimoire that might give off an air of not things that aren't practical, but just it might not have had that kind of, hey, this was used day to day to help with very real problems. Can you just talk about the kind of cunning man / just kind of practicality, really, in all 4 books of the Secrets of Solomon? There just seems to be the spirit of, hey, this is how you can realistically engage with spirits. Can you share about that?
Sure. Most of the methods are very short. Like I say, I think they are well suited to engaging with clients. It's not some of these, month-long or year-and-a-half-long rituals that involve a lot of sitting quietly and meditating and praying and that sort of thing. So it's very practical things that could be performed. The ingredients are fairly easy to obtain, or in a sense, it kind of gives you examples of different things that you could use, and clearly, like the lapidaries of the times, you could draw on other elements from whatever lapidaries you happen to have access to, or collections of properties of herbs like Albertus Magnus compiled and published, and other similar source material.
I did have a question from Frater Ashen Chassan, who mentioned in the book itself, it also talks about there's certain different elements in terms of stone working and specifically stones that you might not see in other grimoires. To Frater Chassan's point, can you talk about that a little bit in terms of the unique or rarer ingredients that you came across?
Yeah, I think bloodstone is a fairly common stone, easy to procure, although you can use as an alternative writing the sigil on parchment. But bloodstone has a long history in folk practice and used as an amulet. It was actually brought to my attention many years ago with the Grand Grimoire and some of the other grimoires about just carrying a bloodstone amulet. And I think that it goes back to this and probably was drawn from Damigaren or some of the old lapidaries, but it had a long folk practice of protecting you from evil spirits or evil influences. Some of the others, like lightning stone, fulgurite, which is used in one of the methods, is listed in the lapidaries with different properties, but obviously associated with lightning. There's actually quite a few natural ingredients that it brings up. Lodestone, magnetic stone, and quite a few plants are mentioned as well. Heliotrope is another one ingredient that's used that has a long history.
Absolutely. And here's from page 4 of your book. When you are writing, one of the first steps is to write your own name on this specific procedure. And it says, place the first letter of your name in place of A and the first letter of your surname in the place of B. It is better still, if you wish, to have it fashioned from green jasper or heliotrope, bloodstone, for those stones indeed have the greatest sympathy with Eastern spirits of the solar order, which are wiser and better than the others. So, to your point, Joe, and this is something that I know Dr. Al Cummins was curious about too, is can you talk about just the pervasive insistence and reliance on magical resonance and just kind of things that have sympathetic qualities throughout the entire book? And can you talk about why is that so important and why is that such an important emphasis?
It explains the rationale for using these physical props, or I'm not sure what the best term for it is, but using these physical ingredients, including the incenses, as a means of attracting and connecting with the spirits, and that they have sympathy with it. They're the actual agents of the magic that's involved, but they are kind of connected by means of these ingredients, and then they can use these physical ingredients as a medium for acting on the physical world. So that's kind of the concept there.
For those people who might not be too familiar, Joe, can you point out what are some of the similarities and also differences between the Grimorium Verum and the Ars Rabidmadar? Because you mentioned that really the Ars Rabidmadar kind of fills in a lot of the gaps, and it kind of helps with consistency, fills in some of the possible inconsistencies of the Grimorium Verum. Can you just kind of comment on that whole issue?
Yeah, I think the beginning of Grimorium Verum is based on the Ars Rabidmadar. There are problems with the first printed edition of Alibec of Grimorium Verum, where he doesn't include all the drawings that he refers to and kind of skips around as if he's only dealing with notes from some other manuscript and not a complete manuscript. So Ars Rabidmadar has a much fuller text and is clearer, more coherent, as it were, the Latin is than the French version in the Grimorium Verum. It fills in sigils that are missing, like the main lamen at the beginning, the spirit sigils, and etc. Obviously, I think it provides more original versions of the names and some of the elements there. Where it differs is the second part of the Grimorium Verum talks about some of the magic tools and the circle and things that are needed for working with the spirits. And Grimorium Verum draws on a Key of Solomon version to fill out those materials. The Ars Rabidmadar, or Secrets of Solomon, has its own methods, and really the only one that kind of survived into Grimorium Verum is the magic circle, which is not really explained in Grimorium Verum, but the drawing is included in there. The last 2 books of the Secrets of Solomon were not apparently used. The more interesting thing to me is what I refer to as the secret of the secrets is kind of totally different in the Grimorium Verum than it is in the Secrets of Solomon. So it has a collection of secrets or spells for different purposes like invisibility, and those are clearly connected with the first part of the Secrets of Solomon in explaining how to use the methods. Grimorium Verum says that it will be explaining things later, but I think that portion of the manuscript did not survive or was not actually included. So I think they kind of filled it in. Along the same lines, one of the major versions of Grimorium Verum that has gotten a lot of popularity is the one that was printed by Simon Blokel. Simon Blokel clearly based it on the original Alibeck text that he wanted to print, but because of the problems, he didn't want to just do a reprinting of it in this case. So he kind of tried to fill in the gaps as best he could. So instead of the missing lamen, he would say to use the sigil of this spirit instead, and pieced it together as best he could. And the result, in a way, is what I refer to as a Victorian iguanodon. They had some pieces of an iguanodon that they pieced together and said this is what it probably looked like. They had one claw. They didn't know that was a claw. They thought it was like a rhinoceros's horn. So the pictures of the iguanodon that you see from Victorian times look more like a rhinoceros than what the more complete skeletons give you. So that's kind of how I look at Blokel's Grimorium Verum, and it's been very popular, influential, so to speak, but it's just interesting to see the evolution of the texts.
One of the most interesting things, Joe, that you've touched on is the words of power and these kind of words that are used in conjurations. There is Arabic influence. The compiler uses English words as words of power, which is the first grimoire that I've ever read where English is used not in terms of like Robert Turner translating something, but in terms of like these in English sounding incantations will help bring forth an interaction with the spirits. Can you just talk about like how did this come about? What are the different possible sources of the words of power? Why is it like that? Just give the listeners an overall kind of sampling of all that.
That's a very interesting aspect of this text. It does use, as you mentioned, Arabic in at least one instance that you were instrumental in pointing out. It uses Greek words. It uses Hebrew. It uses English, some English magic phrase as magic words, which clearly show that they weren't native English speakers when they wrote it. But I see a pattern in a wide range of magic texts where they will pick some words out that sound interesting. And I don't know if it's for dramatic effects or what all the rationale is, but for instance, the Aramaic portions of the Greek New Testament were well known, but they would just pull those words out like Eli, Eli, and use them as magic words. It's just the unfamiliarity of the words lent to the air of mystery, perhaps help them to achieve a particular mindset or dramatic impact on their clients for that matter. There's actually a number of cases. I can't think of too many examples where they have very short phrases like 2, 3, 4 word conjurations. I think that's one of the most charming aspects of this book. A lot of the words are very unique. They don't correspond to anything that I could associate with semantic content, for example, but there are also, as you mentioned, some long incantations, and I see that more often in some of the older or other grimoires where there's many long prayers, which would be hard to memorize, but are perhaps trance-inducing, as I suggest or speculated.
One of the things that Dr. Al Cummins had a question for you to that point, Joe, which is, I'd love to know more from Joe about, and you've touched on this, about the singing of incantations that he emphasizes in Secrets of Solomon, whether Joe thinks that these are traditional arrangements with magic words, or if it is more just spontaneous and it's, full of improvisation, or if it's something else.
I have to believe that it was spontaneously composed around the memorized phrases that they had at hand. I don't know that it would be anything that they would have codified somehow. There might be indications of that in some of the trial records. By the way, there was a ton of other magical texts that were included in this particular case file. So there's a lot of other source material associated with these particular practitioners, but I didn't really see any indication of codifying of the music that was used. I just have basically assumed that they were composing it extemporaneously.
This kind of touches on another point that you've raised, Joe, at the beginning of the book. I remember in the introduction, one of the things you mention, and it's right there in the title, is the secrets of Solomon, and that certain elements are scattered throughout the text that enable the practitioner to kind of find on his or her own and put things together, but also it kind of gives them a formula for specific engagements with spirits that they can craft literally their own ways of engaging with the spirits. Can you just talk about that a little bit, Joe, in terms of what is specifically scattered across the text, and what are some of the kind of examples that are given, which therefore he or she could, do their own formula?
Well, a perfect example of that is what we just talked about, the idea of singing the words and also accompanying the magic words with musical accompaniment, with a lyre in particular. Those are only mentioned in the examples in a couple places, and I think clearly apply to all of the other cases where they have similar short incantations. So that kind of thing, drawing the circle, it's not always explained in each of the spell methods. There's no central location where it says that you should draw a circle and in the circle put the sigil of the spirit. But there are enough instances in the examples that you can infer that that is a common method for working with all of these spirits. And I think that's the same thing with the offerings to the spirits, with the music, with some of the other practices that they draw upon.
The last time you were on the podcast, Joe, you mentioned a little bit about, and you detail this in the book, just the fascinating personal travels and stories and uncovering that you made when you were trying to locate the various manuscripts and paying the visit to various locations. And I thought, in a way, I remember reading George Denn's kind of journey that he went through on the Book of Abramelin and kind of tracking things down and visiting different towns and comparing the texts. And I remember the last time you were on talking about, taking your high-end photography equipment and going and scanning and meeting with people. And can you just share, Joe, a little bit about the personal journey that you went on as an author, an editor, a researcher?
It's kind of been fun. I've had a lot of different people that I've met along the way, and it seems that things just appear when I most need them. Like I worked with transcribing the portions from Adelung, and then I found the Polish manuscript, and then I found the Leipzig manuscript, and they all just kind of built on each other. I met people that owned the Gerald Gardner's library, was able to exchange some mails and phone calls with them and arrange a visit up there. And that introduced me to their whole practice, as well as a lot of other texts. The manuscript in particular that I used for this book has other source texts appended to it, which are fascinating to me, and a virtual gold mine. I could spend a lot of time just studying those. I mentioned the other magic texts that were part of the Venetian Inquisition. They're all leading to different areas to explore. All of these things kind of came together to pull together this book in a very almost magical way. but also left me with a whole list of loose ends or other avenues of things that I really want to explore more, such as the possible survival of a cult of Amalthea, the whole concept of a golem, the Italian folk magic with the ritual music that they use. We just talked a little bit about the music that accompanies these things. There's a whole folk practice. I mentioned just briefly in my other podcast about that, but there's a lot of established folk practice that involves musical performance, and some of it's quite distinctive. There's many other case files in the Venetian Inquisition. I mentioned Laura Malipiero. She was a fairly well-known, renowned witch that had extensive trial records. I think she was brought before the Inquisition 3 different times, and so there's trial records there that are fairly well known. Some of her magic texts are, I think, very important. I've not really had a chance to look into the other case files, but there's a treasure trove, like I say, in that case. Just the Grimorium Verum loose ends. I think there are still things like the Sigil of Skirlin that are not clear even after taking into account the material in the Secrets of Solomon. One of the French manuscripts had the Mirror of Anael in it, which is part of Grimorium Verum, but not part of Secrets of Solomon. So digging more into some of the Grimorium Verum loose ends, could be a whole long project.
Now, I have to ask you, Joe, I mean, how do you keep track of, or how do you delineate what to track down and what to not? Because I know that the researcher, the academic, the scholar in you probably wants to clone yourself, with 100 Joseph Petersons and sending each one down a Venetian alleyway or into a dusty archive and researching things and meeting back at a nexus somewhere and sharing information. But how do you decide, with all these different questions that are raised about new adventures or new texts that you can track down, how do you decide what to focus on and what not to? I remember Dr. Skinner mentioned he has a list on his wall in Singapore, and he knows what he wants to do, and he'll check off something off the list, and then he'll focus on another manuscript. And how do you do that? How do you focus on that?
Well, it's been very hard for me to find a focus. That's been my biggest problem. I have so many interests that I tend to stay focused on to follow a loose end and research things, and can sometimes take quite a while to get back to my original focus. So that's always a challenge. But yeah, I keep lists similar to that. And one of the things we talked about earlier in the week was Ars Almandal, or Almandal, which is a very old Solomonic text that's seen a lot of evolution. I tend to gather up whatever articles and material and links and notes I can on it with the intent of going back later and researching it in more depth. But you end up with a collection of files and folders and notes and such, and which one to get back to is always a challenge, because they're all interesting.
Can you just talk about, just from an overall perspective, why this specific manuscript, without getting into a lot of the details, but just why is this such an important thing in terms of discovering a new manuscript that dates, in many cases, before a lot of the other manuscripts with the Almandal? Can you just share that with the listeners overall?
Yeah, the Almandal is an interesting text in that it seems to draw on some of the older Indic or Indian mandala traditions, and how it got into the Arabic manuscripts and the Latin manuscripts is very curious and interesting. But clearly there's a lot of manuscripts of it going back. It was known in the 12th, 13th century. Reports of it go back that far. Julian Veronese published a critical edition of the Latin texts. Some of them were clearly translations from the Arabic, and some seemed to be more original, perhaps translations directly from the Greek. I did see Dr. Bhadra Reagan was presenting a paper this year at the International Medieval Congress in Kalamazoo, and that's how I became aware of this particular paper, where he has identified a 12th century manuscript of it and presented it. So besides Dr. Vernici's critical edition, there's a lot of work and articles that Dr. Damaris Gare has published on Almondel, and so there's a lot of interest in it and material coming out.
Really quick too, Joe, there's a question from Aaron Leach that he had that I just wanted to run by you. Aaron Leach wants to know, how does Joe feel about the current resurgence of interest in relating the grimoiric demons to older chthonic gods? And there's obviously a practice of, people having a god that was once worshipped, or maybe a chthonic god and now might take on more positive qualities, or people equating, Lucifer with Apollo. I mean, just overall, and especially for yourself as a Zoroastrian, a practicing Zoroastrian, what are your thoughts on this kind of spectrum of beings that might vacillate between chthonic and benign attributes?
Yes, a very interesting question. I think that a lot of people struggle with the idea of supernatural beings or help. And part of this, I think, gets to the concept that if there's an original creator God, a single God, how could he possibly be concerned with the minutia of every individual person and the conflicting interests of people? And there's kind of a need, a psychological need, as it were, for some types of intermediaries. And you see this in a large number of religions, at least that I've studied, and clearly in Zoroastrianism, but Christian mysticism as well, where you want to invoke some of the patron saints for particular benefits, or ancestors for help, supernatural help, rather than to expect God himself to be providing help for you intimately. And so I think that there is a tendency to look for different types of supernatural agents that can act on your behalf. And the nature of those is clearly very complicated because people get different results, and it may be because you're not doing it right or whatever. So you tend to evolve more practices to try to better accommodate your refined understanding of the particular supernatural agents that you're trying to invoke. So I can see how this would evolve.
I guess to that point, Joe, in the Zoroastrian context, are there techniques or methods for dealing with different classes of spirits, either in ritual or in annual rituals or ceremonies? Or just, I guess a lot of listeners might be curious about that. Can you shed any light on that?
There's a number of classes of supernatural beings in Zoroastrianism. Besides God Ahura Mazda himself, there's the Ameshaspentas, which is sometimes translated as archangels, the 6 or 7 highest spiritual beings. There's a whole range of angels, or yazads or yazatas. There's the Avestan equivalent of genies, Jaini, of fairies or parikas, a wide range of different supernatural beings, and the whole class of devas, or evil spirits, including the highest demon, the Angramanyu, which is directly opposed to God. So
I think some people might say, wow, Joseph Peterson is a Zoroastrian, and yet there's all this interesting work into, as you say, very mysterious or dark grimoires like the Grimorium Verum or Secrets of Solomon. And so I think people are wondering, as you go through the process of these texts, do you approach it differently as a Zoroastrian? Do you kind of work the text differently? There's all kinds of different things that people might wonder about, and that's pretty cool.
A lot of the Zoroastrian magic practice of the Zoroastrians is to, and I'd have to say this is the case also with the Jewish practice as well, but it's basically trying to repel the evil spirits and protect against the evil spirits and attract and please the good spirits. When I encounter something like an amulet that's carved into bloodstone, I see parallels to that sort of thing. There are Zoroastrian amulets with different prayer texts and images on them that harken back to some of these same things. And there's also Jewish equivalents as well.
we do have a question from Annalise, who wanted to ask you, in addition to what Annalise and myself really know and respect as being a huge area of focus for you, which is, the 2 websites that you run and maintain, giving access to so many different documents, as well as the dozens of books that you've written and edited. In addition to that incredible amount of research and time and effort, what are some other areas, Annalise is asking, or other projects or things interests that you might be really proud of that maybe a lot of other listeners might not know about that you'd kind of like to share a little bit?
Sure. As I kind of implied before, I tend to spread myself pretty thin, but I do have a number of other interests. I'm a big enthusiast for folk music. I play largely percussion, but participate in the Renaissance Fair, recreating Renaissance and earlier music, as well as Irish and other Celtic music. Especially love playing for dancers. That's a great interest of mine. I practice Tai Chi every day and Qigong, and people may not know that about me, but that's been a big influence on my life. What else? I designed a couple of tarot decks based on the earliest designs, which I love doing. That was a tremendous amount of fun, and the people that have gotten them have really given me positive feedback on it. So that adds to the fun too, but end up getting spread pretty thin sometimes.
We'll make sure to link to a video in the podcast where you actually unboxed one of the tarot decks, to your specifications when you got it in the mail. Can you just tell our listeners about that? I love those unboxing videos. Those are so cool.
Yeah, this is the revision I did of the Noble Tarot, which is the earliest example of a Tarot de Marseille. The first edition sold out very quickly, so I went ahead and made some slight revisions of it this time, was able to drop the price a little bit as well. It's been great fun to see it materialize, and as you said, I unboxed the first one from the shipment and check it on camera to make sure that they followed through with all the special requirements that I asked them to do. So, yeah, that was fun.
Can I ask, what are some of the projects, esoteric events, anything coming up or anything that you might be working on that you can share? Of course, you're working on something, multiple things, but anything you can share with the listeners in terms of books, projects, publications, anything that you want them to kind of keep their eyes peeled or their ear to the ground for?
One is the Trithemius Book of Wonders, which is a fairly interesting magic text, and he has different methods of scrying listed in there, which kind of turned up as a result of searching for other sources for the Trithemius invoking spirits into a crystal and those methods. There's a lot of magic texts associated with Trithemius that have turned up as a result of studying that text. The Almandel, as we just talked about, trying to assemble and make sense of all the different research that's gone on. I'm looking forward to seeing Dr. Reagan's article and translation of that. Those are some of the things. I'm working on the Vieville Tarot. Not sure that I will do a full run of that, but that's another earliest example of the Belgian design. So it's fairly interesting because it's so different from the Tarot de Marseille. So that's another one that could possibly materialize.
For the listeners out there who have not, and I shame them if they have not checked out either of your two websites, I shame them with all of the guilt that a medieval church could put on someone. Can you just share, Joe, about where can people find you? How can people learn more or access some of the texts? I have esotericarchives.com is the main esoteric website. I have a list of my books and articles on the main page. People are interested in seeing any of that, including the tarot deck. Avesta.org is a collection of Zoroastrian texts that I assembled. It actually predates Esoteric Archives, or fairly close, but that's another source of information. Books are available on Amazon and other book
outlets, Barnes & Noble, Magus Books, other places. So Secrets of Solomon, there is a hardbound edition as well as a softbound. With Grimorium Verum, people were constantly requesting a hardbound edition because they bought the paperbound. They use it so much that it's fallen apart, and they bought a second one, and can they get hardbound? But this one is available in both, fairly attractively priced, I think, compared to some books these days. But hopefully that will help to encourage people to pick up a copy.
Are there any other parting thoughts, or is there anything else that you just want listeners or people who are interested, not only in the Secrets of Solomon, but just kind of, even if they're just beginning, starting to read some of the esoteric texts that you put out there, just any kind of parting words or kind of advice that you may have for people, especially if they're like, Joseph Peterson, wow, he's got so much stuff, this is great, but what do I do? Where do I start? Any advice on that front?
I'm glad you brought that up. I think I'm one of the proponents of trying something out, not going to great lengths, 18 months of ritual before you try and do something. I think see if these things work for you and keep it simple to start off with. As far as the other thoughts, I'll just mention I really appreciate the feedback that I get from people. Someone just posted, I think Fred Ashen Chassan constructed a bloodstone amulet according to the Secrets of Solomon, and what that looked like, seeing what that looks like and what people's experiences are with it. I appreciate all of the feedback and thoughts that people have. Your own information on this looks like a quote from the Quran, that sort of thing. It's invaluable to me. Probably the biggest surprise in all the years I've been doing this is that I've gotten very little feedback from the websites. Corrections, clear errors are very few and far between, and the same thing with the books, and getting that feedback is invaluable to me, so I really appreciate it.
Cannot thank you enough, Joe, just for having these amazing publications, and definitely for the listeners out there, check them out, and any feedback that you have for Joe or anything as well going forward, and just really reading the texts and checking them out as well. That's some really, really good advice. Joseph Peterson, you are always welcome back on the podcast, and really looking forward to have you on again, and just thank you so much for taking the time and stopping by today.
Oh, thanks a lot, Alex. It's been a lot of fun.
Okay, how cool, listeners, was it to hear again from Joseph Peterson? It is truly a gift of his time and his wisdom, and I've been reading and rereading his Secrets of Solomon book, which for me also helps accentuate other grimoires of interest in my orbit, such as the relationship between Book 3 of the Secrets of Solomon and the Angels of the Air and the Heptameron, for example. It was so cool connecting some of the dots there. So listeners, I do also have a few updates for you that I hope you will find of interest. In addition to YouTube and iTunes and Spreaker.com and Stitcher Radio, the Glitch Bottle podcast is now also on Spotify. So thank you so much to the ever awesome Annalise for mentioning this and helping me get it on there. Also, I'm hoping to get Glitch Bottle on the Deezer subscription service for podcasts, so make sure to be on the lookout for that. And in other news, I want to thank you, the listeners, for all of your awesome questions, your comments, and your insights, both to my Facebook page and also on YouTube. There are so many questions from listeners that I was actually thinking about doing an Ask Me Anything podcast where I can directly answer anything that comes to mind. So even though it feels odd for me to be the one answering questions instead of asking them, please let me know if that would be something you'd like to hear. Also, to listeners suggesting guests on the podcast, I want to thank you so much for these great suggestions and points in the right direction. And I'm also looking into all of the guests that you suggest, and I think you'll be pretty pleased in the coming months with some future discussions. So those are all the major updates for now. I will cork my mouth shut right now, but in the meantime, you can make sure to check out the previous episodes of the Glitch Bottle podcast and other magical Glitch Bottle news on YouTube, youtube.com/glitchbottle, and you can download and listen to podcast episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Spreaker.com, and Stitcher Radio. Also, please make sure to subscribe and follow us on YouTube. And if you subscribe, make sure to hit that little notification bell for new episodes as soon as they post. And also follow us on Twitter at GlitchBottle. Our intro music is the track Tornado by David Zeste. Our magical interest is fueled by sincerity, passion, amazing guests, and of course, a copious amount of clinking coffee cups. So until next time, this is Alexander Eth reminding you to invoke often, uncork the uncommon, and keep the light.